We've probably all seen it, right? That slow, quiet withdrawal. It's easy to miss, maybe, until it suddenly feels like the new normal, a diminished one. We came across this story, an anecdote about a woman named Mrs. K in our sources today. She used to be really active every morning, purpose, humming while she watered her plants, opening the curtains wide, making her bed first thing. That was her routine. But lately, well, the bed stays unmade, curtains stay closed, plants look thirsty. And, when her daughter asks about a walk, Mrs. K just kind of shrugs, turns away, and murmurs, "What's the point of even trying?" Okay, so let's really dig into this. This shift, this quiet pulling back, it often gets written off, doesn't it, as like laziness or just a bad mood, especially when we see it in older adults. But the sources we looked at, they define it very differently as something learned, a mechanism, not really a character flaw. It's called learned helplessness. So,
Mhm.
our mission in this deep dive is to understand what that pattern actually is, how it tends to develop as people age, and maybe most importantly, how we can stop accidentally feeding it and instead foster its antidote. Self efficacy.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is how simple, yet heavy, that core message of learned helplessness is. It's just, why bother? It's a signal, really. A
Yeah.
signal that the connection between putting in effort and getting some kind of result, well, it's broken down for that person. We're not necessarily talking about clinical depression here, though they can look similar sometimes. We're looking at the specific behavioral messages this pattern sends out and why getting the mechanism, not judging the person's intent, is absolutely the crucial first step if you want to offer real support. So if you're watching someone you care about kind of shrink their world like this conversation is definitely for you.
Let's start right there with the definition, because the key word is learned. This is a learned response, isn't it?
Exactly. Learned helplessness, it develops after someone has repeated experiences where their actions just don't seem to change anything. Or maybe worse, where putting in effort consistently leads to something negative, like failure or criticism. So the brain, quite logically in a way, learns to save energy. It learns that effort doesn't seem to pay off anymore. Why waste it?
And this process, it seems to have some specific triggers when it comes to aging adults.
Yes, this is where it gets really, really interesting in the context of aging. Because for older folks, it often starts subtly. Maybe those everyday things, like carrying laundry or making lunch, they just start getting harder or they take noticeably longer. Our sources point to four main contributors that can kind of speed up this learned futility and start chipping away at self-belief. First is when help is given for them rather than with them. It unintentionally sends that message, like, you can't manage this, so I have to do it. Second, when any feedback they get focuses mostly on mistakes, instead of acknowledging the effort, the sheer act of trying, regardless of how perfectly it turned out.
Okay, wait, that first one, helping for them. I mean, that feels like such a natural impulse for a loving family member,
Yeah.
right? It's faster, maybe it gets done better in that moment. But you're saying we're solving our own, like, time crunch, maybe, but accidentally signaling incompetence?
That's precisely it. It's a tough habit to break because it often comes from a good place. But the underlying message can be damaging over time.
Hmm.
So the third contributor is when those daily routines just get gradually taken over by others. A well-meaning daughter, a caregiver, a spouse steps in more and more. And the fourth one, which you touched on, it feels particularly difficult.
Hmm.
Trying something and maybe failing becomes painful. It could be embarrassing or just physically exhausting. So if trying leads to stress or correction from someone else, well, doing nothing starts to feel, frankly, safer, less hassle.
So if we're trying to spot this, how do we differentiate? How do we see the behavioral message, my actions don't matter, instead of just jumping to, oh, they're just being lazy today?
Well, the signs, the behaviors themselves, are pretty clear indicators that this mechanism is at play. You'll likely see the person start to actively avoid or even refuse tasks they used to do all the time, things they managed fine before. You might hear those kinds of phrases, oh, you do it, or I'll just mess it up anyway. Minimizing their own potential, they might become more passive, maybe waiting for reminders for things they always used to remember on their own. And ultimately, yeah, you see that loss of interest, appearing withdrawn, disconnected, just like Mrs. K pulling those curtains shut.
That avoidance piece seems key, doesn't it? That's what keeps the whole cycle going.
Oh, absolutely. If we look at it from a behavioral perspective, learned helplessness is really maintained by something called avoidance reinforcement. We should probably unpack that for a second because it's really critical. See, most people think reinforcement means getting something good, like a treat, right? Positive reward. But here, the reward is actually the removal or the absence of something negative. By not trying to make the bed or not trying the walk or not loading the dishwasher, they avoid the potential struggle, the frustration, maybe the failure. And that successful avoidance, It brings immediate short-term comfort, safety even, and that feeling of relief. That is the reward. It reinforces the not trying, making the whole pattern dig in deeper.
Wow, okay. So the system itself rewards the inaction. That makes a chilling kind of sense. But okay, this is where we need to pivot, right? Because if helplessness can be learned through these negative loops,
Hmm.
then the sources strongly suggest that confidence can be learned too. Which brings us to this idea of self-efficacy, the antidote, really, to that why bother message.
Exactly. Self-efficacy, simply put, is the belief that your actions do influence outcomes. It's that core belief in your own ability to succeed, maybe not at everything, but in specific situations or with specific tasks. And you really can't talk about self-efficacy without bringing in the psychologist Albert Bandura. He was the pioneer of this research. Bandura's work is just fundamental here. He wrote, and this quote is powerful, "People's beliefs about their abilities have a profound effect on those abilities." I went on to say, ability is not a fixed property. There is a huge variability in how you perform, depending on which beliefs you hold. So it's not just about positive thinking in a vacuum. It's about building real evidence for yourself, repeated evidence, that you are competent in certain areas.
And that belief system isn't just a nice feeling, it has real measurable effects, especially in aging. We found this specific study from 2022 in the Journal of Aging and Health. And what it found was that older adults who reported higher levels of self-efficacy, they were significantly more likely to maintain both their independence and their emotional stability. So it connects directly. That psychological belief translates into quality of life.
Yes, absolutely. And, before we jump into the how-to, the practical stuff, maybe we should quickly touch on the difference between learned helplessness and clinical depression, because that comes up a lot. People get them confused.
Good point. Yeah. How do we tell them apart?
Well, the main difference is usually in the scope and maybe the origin. Clinical depression tends to affect mood much more broadly. It's often systemic, hitting motivation, sleep, interest in pretty much everything, and there's often a neurochemical component involved. Learned helplessness, on the other hand, it often shows up more specifically, maybe around certain tasks or routines that used to be easy, or areas where the person has hit that wall of frustration and failure repeatedly. So if Mrs. K is, say, happy and engaged talking about her grandkids, but then completely shuts down when asked about folding laundry, that pattern points more towards learned helplessness specific to that task rather than a pervasive overall depression. It's often task-specific, whereas depression tends to be more systemic.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction. Essential, even. So let's move into the practical side then. What does this all mean if you're someone, wanting to help someone relearn that confidence? The sources gave us 5 pretty concrete strategies, all focused on behavioral support, really, reminding us that confidence grows one small success at a time. This is about shifting the reinforcement, right? Away from rewarding avoidance and towards rewarding effort.
Exactly. The whole mindset has to shift from doing for them to supporting their action. So the first strategy is all about rebuilding small wins. This means you have to look at the tasks they've stopped doing, like making the bed, and break it down. Break it down into the absolute smallest possible step where success is pretty much guaranteed, or at least the chance of failure is really, really low.
Okay, so back to Mrs. K. She stopped making the bed, stopped watering the plants. What's the absolute smallest win we could possibly set up there?
Well, not making the whole bed, certainly. Maybe the win is just pulling the sheet up smoothly to the pillow. That's it. Or folding one single bath towel correctly instead of tackling the whole laundry basket. With the plants, maybe success is just filling the watering can. Not even watering anything yet, just filling the can. The point is, these are tiny actions where the link between effort and a visible, positive outcome is immediate and undeniable. They did it.
That makes sense. And it leads right into the second strategy. Focus on effort, not the outcome. Shifting the praise, shifting the attention away from perfection onto just participating.
Mm-hmm.
The goal here is to make the effort itself feel rewarding, to counteract that old negative feedback loop where only perfect counted or where trying led to criticism.
Exactly. You're not saying, wow, the quilt is perfectly centered. You're genuinely praising the act of trying. The source gave a great example, just saying something like, I love that you gave that a try, or wow, that took some real persistence.
Right. So for Mrs. K, maybe we say, it's wonderful you got that sheet pulled up so far. Even if the blanket's still all bunched at the bottom, you're acknowledging the action.
Precisely. The third strategy is about the environment. Simplify the environment.
Yeah.
Because too many steps, too much clutter around, even too many choices that can trigger immediate overwhelm. And overwhelm often leads straight back to that avoidance response we talked about. So you need to reduce the clutter, make the steps in a routine really clear, maybe even visible. If Mrs. K has to walk across the room, find the watering can under a pile of mail, walk back, fill it, then navigate around 20 different plants. That's a lot of potential failure points.
Yeah.
Streamline the process, make it easier to start and succeed.
Okay, I can see that. But I admit, the fourth strategy makes me a bit nervous. Delay assistance. That sounds incredibly hard for caregivers.
Hmm.
Our instinct is to jump in, right? To prevent struggle, especially if we see them getting frustrated. Isn't there a risk there that we're just watching them flounder and maybe making the helplessness worse instead of better?
That is such an important question because the timing, the how, is absolutely everything here. Delaying assistance doesn't mean standing back passively while someone has a meltdown. No. It means consciously giving just a few extra seconds of quiet time before automatically stepping in. The source actually noted that even 3 to 10 seconds, just that brief pause, can be enough to invite independence. It gives them that vital little window to initiate the action themselves before your help becomes the expected learned response. You're creating space for them to connect their own action to the result, however small.
Ah, okay. So it's not about letting them fail miserably. It's about creating that tiny space for self-initiation. That slight pause is the difference between inviting independence and reinforcing dependence. Okay, I get it now.
Exactly. And the fifth strategy ties it all together, really. It's about restoring a sense of control and partnership. Share problem solving. So instead of just telling them what needs to be done or how to do it, you bring them back into the process. Acknowledge their agency. Ask things like, what do you think we should tackle first? Or how should we approach that walk today? Any ideas? This gives back that feeling of control and collaboration, which is the complete opposite of the experiences that might have created the helplessness pattern in the first place, where their choices felt irrelevant or were ignored.
And the sources also mention being careful about how we encourage, right?
Mm.
Gently. Frame efforts as opportunities, not like tests they have to pass.
Yes, exactly. Aggressive pushing can backfire badly.
The specific suggestion was something like, hey, let's just try one step together, especially if it's something daunting like that walk Mrs. K keeps refusing. It breaks down the overwhelm, micro successes.
Hmm.
And we probably shouldn't forget about technology here either. It can sometimes act as a kind of non-judgmental support, can't it?
That's a great point. Technology can offer gentle environmental cues. Things like visual checklists on a tablet, maybe gentle audio reminders from a smart speaker, or even smart home cues like lights changing color. They provide structure and prompts without the emotional weight or potential judgment that can sometimes come, even unintentionally, from another person. It's accountability without the risk of feeling corrected. Right. So when you pull it all together, the core takeaway, I think, is really hopeful. Learned helplessness isn't a permanent state. It was learned, often slowly, through repetition and the reinforcement of avoidance. And it absolutely can be unlearned the exact same way. One small, concrete, undeniable success at a time. We're essentially reframing the whole issue. When Mrs. K stopped trying, it wasn't that her motivation vanished overnight. It was more likely that her belief in the effectiveness of her actions eroded. Probably because that feedback loop got broken by those accidental interventions or repeated negative outcomes.
It's powerful. Learn helplessness kind of whispers, why even try, doesn't it? But consistent, thoughtful behavioral support whispers back, you can. Let's try this tiny piece.
Yeah.
And if we really grasp that confidence grows in exactly the same way that helplessness once did through repeated feedback, focused efforts, small successes, then we understand that hope itself, just like behavior, is learned. So maybe the question for all of us is, what action, no matter how small it seems, could you help someone initiate today? What tiny step could start building that new positive feedback loop?